Okay, it's time for the Q&A.
All right. Good. First of all, good morning to everybody here in the U.S. And I want to say good evening to you, Dr. Wright. Once again, it's thoroughly great to have the opportunity to be with you. Will you allow this American to say something about your presentation before I get to ask my question?
Of course, of course.
As I listened to your presentation, and because I worked in the UK for some time while I was an executive at Nike, I was completely gobsmacked by what you had to say. Your presentation, both in how you presented and the content of it, really almost sounds classical, and I really appreciate that very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The heart of my question is that one of the struggles that we have here and literally around the world is the ability to bring the millennial generation into a conversation and relationship with God. And what I found, and I think many have found, is that justice is one of those ways to bring them in. Would you mind giving us, because again, you're talking to a lot of people that may not be millennials here, how would you position a conversation, or at least a start of a conversation with a millennial, recognize the fact that they are passionate about justice, but skeptical about God, and how do you bring them together?
Yeah. That's a great question. I should say most of the millennials that I know best are members of my own family because I used to be in student pastoral ministry 20 or 30 years ago, but I haven't actually done that full on in recent years. So I've been working with PhD students, mostly in St. Andrews, the last 10 years, and they are a very special cohort who don't fit the model of the ordinary millennials. But I know enough about what I think your question is about to say that within that millennial world, where there is considerable skepticism about the church and about religion and so on, there is nevertheless all the more a hunger to see the world put right. And that comes out in being passionate about climate change. It comes out in people being passionate about the racial tensions in our world and the whole Black Lives Matter movement and so on. And it comes out in all sorts of political issues, social issues, ecological issues, which people really get far more worked up about than my generation ever did when we were teenagers. And remember, I was the 60s generation when we had protest songs and Vietnam War and all that stuff going on. But I see real passion for justice in depth and in detail. And it seems to me all that is right and good and true. But then I think one of the points that has to be made is that this is not new. They are not the first generation to yearn for some kind of putting right in the world at every level. And that tragically, when we look at the movements that have tried to do that stuff before, go back 200 years to the Great Revolutions, or mid-19th century to some of the revolutions then, or the early 20th century with the Russian Revolution, these were all people who really wanted to put the world right and reckoned they had to seize power and do it. As you look at what then happened, again and again they made matters worse. And so then we face the millennials with the problem. So what you're going to do? And you can either collapse back into cynicism and say, well, there's nothing we can do. And tragically, some Christians would say there's nothing we can do till Jesus comes again. And the answer is, sorry, Jesus has already come and he's died and been raised and he's sent his spirit. Now get on with it. But that's for my second half. But so I would want to resonate as much as possible with their passion for putting the world right, and then to explore with them the ways in which people have tried to do that in the past and why that has come crashing down on its face. And then perhaps talk about readings of the gospel story, which show that in that brokenness is where we meet the true God, who the churches have often hushed up, who actually came and shared that brokenness himself. And that's the argument of this book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's as we talk about that issue of justice, it's interesting even as you go through your broken signposts. As we talk about one of the other ones, love, it seems like this generation has attempted to bring justice, or the attempt to find justice in our culture outside of the context of doing it in its primary purpose, which is love. Old Testament, you looked at the very point of what we were seeing throughout Old Testament: widows, orphans, homeless, poor, which would be four of the primary areas where justice was to be measured, and where we were to actually go to people unlike us and love them and serve them. It seems like we have a generation today that wants justice, but not at the expense of loving our enemies and loving those that are like us. And so unpack that a little bit too, just saying, okay, here's this justice issue, but it can't be separated from this idea of loving those who are different than you and actually serving people that are in need or those that are oppressed.
Yes, I think an awful lot of young people in principle resonate with that. It's hard to say, and obviously hard to generalize, because if I went out on the street and found some Oxford students and quizzed them about it, I'd probably get several different opinions. But I think there is a yearning to do the right thing for the wider world. And the more people realize they've grown up in a multicultural society, there are some, of course, who resent that and are nervous about losing their own identity for whatever reason, and so are clinging to subsections of humanity as their natural identity partners, whether it's the radical white supremacists or whether it's whatever. We construct different identities so that we feel safe there. But I think there are lots and lots of people around the world, as far as I can tell, who actually, if faced with Psalm 72, which says, do justice for, or that the king will do justice for the orphan and the widow and so on, that people say, yeah, absolutely. I can think of somebody down the street or somebody I saw on the television news the other day. We need to care for these people and not to wash our hands of them. So I think that is an imperative that many would resonate with. I'm not sure I picked up all of your question, but the microphone went funny in the middle. But was that, am I on target there?
Yeah, I think that's really, really clear. Thank you so much.
I was going to take one out of the chat. Is there?
Yeah.
Is there one in the chat?
There isn't. Maybe
okay.
there's a couple that are coming up.
Okay.
Hey, let's talk just, as you go through, there's so much meat in every one of those. We could have a conversation for an hour on any one of your 7. I was really struck as you dove into the whole freedom signpost, and obviously, that the sun sets free indeed. We as leaders and on this call are many pastors, we're really good at believing in freedom and preaching freedom, yet oftentimes we're very stuck ourselves. And as we think about that concept of freedom, talk personally, Tom, just about how you, with all of your pressures, challenges, insecurities, how you have been able to live a life of freedom in the midst of all the challenges with your humanity.
Insofar as I have, I mean, because if I said what would it look like to be totally free, if I was told at 7 o'clock in the morning, you are completely free today, forget your diary, don't do anything with all of that, then what would I most want to do? And I would probably want to go for a walk in the country, or I'd probably want to go and play with my grandchildren, or I would probably want to curl up with a book that I've been meaning to read for weeks and haven't had a chance to, or perhaps some combination of all of the above. Now, so freedom would be freedom from constraints, but also freedom for doing some of those things that I really, really enjoy. And there would undoubtedly be music in there as well. And I have been fortunate in so many ways and richly blessed in that things like that have filled my life in all sorts of ways, but I have routinely also chosen to do things which have, as it were, trapped me, where I've foolishly said, yes, I will do this, and then later think, why on earth did I say yes to that? Because that has restricted me in these ways and those ways. And of course, not to talk too personally, but sin does this all the time. When I choose to go my own way rather than listening to the voice of the Spirit and to the wisdom of Scripture, etc., then I find myself in a blind alley, in a very unfree position, and like the prodigal son, have to come back and say sorry and please can we start again. And it's a constant struggle. But I think then part of the challenge of freedom in the New Testament, and we'll come on to this perhaps in the second half, is about what Jesus said to Peter when he forgives him for betraying him, for denying him, but then commissions him to do work in which Jesus knows Peter will find the freedom which comes from being truly the person you are created to be. And then he says, when you're older, somebody will dress you up and take you where you don't want to go. Follow me. Peter won't want to go and be crucified upside down, which is what tradition says happened to him, but that will be following Jesus. And following Jesus is the ultimate definition of freedom. Well, isn't that interesting? Doesn't look like what we might have imagined. And so again and again, the vocation of freedom, and I say this to myself, is not about simply saying, what would I most like to do today? But ultimately saying, what does God want to do, which will en route enhance my genuine humanness? And I'll only find that out by following and coming and seeing, which is the challenge of the gospel.
Dr. Wright, I apologize. When I first began, I forgot that Mark's name was up there on the front. My name is Matt. And Mark Estes. Somebody might have considered that there are two of us. Right, there you go. One of the things that you talked about, there are two questions in the chat that I'm going to try, and it may be the next time around, to try to pull that together. The question I had was the question about power and the importance of what you discussed regarding the use and potentially, obviously, the abuse of power. And one of the things that I have felt is very important is the ability to understand that you may have power, but you restrain yourself from having to use it. Again, as you speak and teach, how do you help people understand the importance using the example of Jesus, whether in the Johannine Gospels or throughout, the example of Jesus, who had power, but truly was very restrained in how he used it, and particularly about the crucifixion.
Yeah, of course. No, I think and this is really important for a biblical political theology. And backstory here, ever since the 18th century, with the Western separation of church and state, and I know we in Britain have an established church, but we have still basically separated the two, because that's what the Enlightenment did for whether it's Germany or France or Britain or America or whatever. Ever since then, we have struggled with the idea that maybe there is a political theology in the New Testament, but there sure is, because the New Testament includes all those bits which affirm that God, we're monotheists, that God, the creator of the world, wants his world to be run wisely by wise human beings. And this is quite clear in, say, the book of Proverbs. It's not accidental that the book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon, or that the much later Jewish book called the Wisdom of Solomon, again, is a Solomonic book, and contains at its heart wise advice for rulers as to how to go about ruling wisely. And here's the trick. God does not want anarchy. God is not honored by anarchy, because, as I said before, if there is no power being exercised anywhere, the bad guys and the bullies will say, wow, this is great, we can clean up. There's some weak people down the road, we can go and beat their door down and rob them, and then we'll get rich, or words to that effect. And likewise, all down through human life and society, the strong people in a family can beat up and prey on the weak people, and so on. So somehow power matters, but power has to be restrained and held within a framework. And it seems to me the classic example of this is when Jesus says to Pontius Pilate, you could have no power over me unless it was given you from above. In other words, Jesus says to Pilate, that God the Father has given him, Pilate, power over him, Jesus. And Jesus respects that, which is one of the most extraordinary sentences in the New Testament. And then he says, therefore, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. In other words, when God gives power to a human being, whether it's to be the parent of a family or whether it's to run a country, God will hold you accountable. God is not mocked. God is not fooled. And when people abuse power, God will hold them to account. And somehow the Christian church has always struggled to articulate this. It has often in the past articulated it, but for the last 200 years, we've kind of forgotten that and said, no, being a Christian is saying your prayers and going to heaven when you die, and we'll leave the power stuff to the politicians. And then we wonder why they mess it up. And somehow there is a vocation to use power wisely, which is a biblical vocation. But that's why, and again, maybe I'll get back to this in the second half, or I'll say it now, in John's Gospel, chapter 16, my goodness, when the Spirit comes, the Spirit will convict the world of sin and righteousness and judgment. But excuse me, how does the Spirit do that? Jesus gives us the Spirit and says, as the Father sent me, so I send you. In other words, watch how Jesus held the Pharisees to account, held the rich to account, held Pontius Pilate to account. That's what the Spirit is to enable us to do in our turn. And if that isn't a vocation to keep us rather anxious for a little while, then I don't know what is.
So we will come back to the questions in the chat. So the next time around, make sure to get those together. This has been great.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed it. It's wonderful.
Why don't we just go ahead and jump into session 2, and we'll just turn it back over to you.
Okay.